On April 13, 1999, 8 FBI agents surrounded a blank TV screen in morbid anticipation. As it clicked on and the footage began to play, 2 figures now appeared before them. One man and one woman, both cloaked in black robes. Arms and legs bound by red nylon straps, a clearly disoriented woman lay sprawled on a black table, barely clinging to consciousness. The silver duct tape that covered both her eyes and mouth allowed for no protest as the masked man chuckled and revealed a blistering hot cattle prod. Muffled screams echoed throughout the small trailer as the man slowly and methodically pushed the rod into the woman's vagina. A plume of smoke filled the screen as her body viciously contorted in a vain effort to escape from the pain. The agents in the room stood there, aghast by what they were viewing. Some of them shifted back and forth as if feeling phantom pains, but of course, this was only a negligible amount in comparison to what she was going through. The 2 captors laughed in pure ecstasy as they continued the horrific acts. The pain too much, her body gave out and she slipped unconscious. As the video came to an end, several of the agents quickly left the trailer and proceeded to throw up in the yard. The video that they had just viewed was, unfortunately, only one of the countless tapes that the perpetrator had filmed and sold to many over his 40-year crime span. The serial killer known as the Toy Box Killer managed to live a double life. In one, he was known as the dependable, hardworking, and docile park mechanic, while in the other, he existed as a malevolent and sadistic entity whose sole purpose was to subject his victims to the highest levels of pain imaginable. Hello guys, my name is Nate, and today we're going to take a look at one of the most evil serial killers in US history, David Parker Ray. David Parker Ray was born to parents Nettie Opal Parker and Cecil Ray on November 6, 1939 in Belen, New Mexico. Now, with this being the last few years of the Great Depression, job prospects were essentially non-existent, and income was subsequently few and far between. The weight of this reality weighed too heavy on Cecil, who often turned to alcohol as an escape. This, coupled with his already short temper, created an extremely hostile environment for David, who was usually the recipient of his father's rage. When David was around 10 years old, Cecil divorced Nettie and ran away to Albuquerque, New Mexico, abandoning his now 2 young kids. They had another one named Peggy. Both unable and unwilling to take care of the 2, Nettie sent David and his sister to live with Cecil's parents in Mountain Air, New Mexico. Known to be a strict disciplinarian and devout fundamentalist Christian, David's grandfather never really gave the 2 a break. Literally every morning, David and his sister were expected to be in the fields working before going to school dressed in their Sunday's best, all to end the day doing the back-breaking labor that they had started it with. For David, not meeting his grandfather's strict set of expectations led to harsh physical repercussions. His best friend at the time was noted as saying, if his grandfather wanted David to do something, he'd jump. Maybe in today's terms he was abusive, but we called it being strict. In school, David was often bullied as he was quiet and known to be quite passive, choosing to never retaliate against the verbal and physical assaults that he faced daily. The abuse at home and school forced him into a life of solitude, affording him only 2 friends, his sister Peggy and his best friend, Audie Miranda. In his solitude, he found a love for drawing and journaling, both things he frequently do to escape his, if we're being honest here, very depressing childhood. His father, despite remaining in his life, had a detrimental effect on his development. As mentioned before, he was a severe alcoholic, and during the rare times that he visited his kids, he left true crime porn magazines for his young son, who is a whole fetus of a human. These magazines often depicted intense BDSM images of women, which presented David another, much more inappropriate escape from reality. These images, along with his relationship with his estranged mother, which was described as, quote, lacking any maternal bonds, created a very dangerous view of women within his young mind. With each day that passed, David's view of women slowly degraded, so much so that he begins to see them not fully as people, but now instead something lesser. When he was around 13 years old, his grandfather gifted him a scooter, which, quite honestly, changed his life as it helped reveal his natural mechanical talents. But in the long run, these skills were an unfortunate discovery. He honestly should have just stayed ungifted and sad. Everyone would have been better for it. As he delved deeper into these dark fantasies, he, at the age of 15, took it upon himself to build a private dungeon. It was in his dungeon that he discovered a love for fornicating with holes that he made in the dirt, I had to learn about that, so you guys do as well. Congratulations. While snooping around one day, his sister Peggy actually stumbled upon some of his drawings that depicted women bound and tortured, and even murdered. When she confronted him with this, asking for why he would have created such a thing, he simply laughed and said it was a new hobby of his. Choosing to ignore this shining red flag, his sister took him for his word and left the situation alone. Researchers have stated that sadistic fantasies, David's for example, act as an outlet for hostility and aggression, as well as a form of escape for the child, come to serve as a substitute for the child's sense of mastery. Essentially, because he could not take control of his life, these fantasies, twisted as they may have been, acted as a means for him to unleash his rage, but of course, just in some of the most diabolical ways possible. Although it appears that these drawings weren't just a hobby for the confused teen, and may have actually been illustrated records of his earliest crimes. According to a confession from one of his future accomplices, David had kidnapped a local schoolgirl and tied her to a tree before torturing her to death. This is considered to be his first murder and is quite honestly terrifying that he was capable of something so gruesome at such a young age. In 1957, David's grandmother died, fracturing the impromptu family. David was sent to live with his mother in Albuquerque, New Mexico, while his sister stayed with the local family. Despite being raised in the same household and experiencing similar abuses, his sister Peggy proved to excel, becoming quite popular with all those around her. David, however, David's mind was gone. The severe neglect, physical, verbal, and mental abuse, isolation, early introduction to BDSM, neglect again, he was fucked up. His family really did try their best to speedrun creating a serial killer, and unfortunately, this was one of the few categories that they overachieved in. To him, women were no longer beings with wills of their own, but now purely objects to be used by him as a part of his twisted fantasies. And now, the product of their labor was being released into the world to do as he pleased. Not long after moving out of his mother's house, David met his first wife, 17-year-old Thelma Frost, in 1959. But instead of enjoying his time with his young bride, David joined the military, where he was deployed to Korea for 3 years as a general mechanic. This job unfortunately provided him with a treasure trove worth of knowledge, as he was able to frequently tinker on planes and other complex machines. Though, as we will see, David had a very bad habit of abandoning his responsibilities, in this case his newly pregnant wife, on some random adventure whenever he got bored or uncomfortable. It is believed that during these periods of absence from his family, he had been fully indulging in his fantasies of torturing and possibly killing women. Thelma gave birth to their son David Elvin in 1960, but David's absence had already done its damage and the marriage soon fell apart just a year later. He was granted emergency leave to go back home, where he gained full custody of his son. Soon after, the army deployed David to Texas, with him choosing to leave his young son with his mother. This is the same mother that again had, quote, no maternal bonds with her children and never really tried to establish one. Some beautiful decision making right here, just keeping the cycle going. He met his second wife a few months later, but to no surprise, the relationship ended 3 months later. After being discharged from the army in 1963, he moved back in with his mother and now 3-year-old son, where he began working alongside his stepfather at a trucking company. Unfortunately, 3 years later, he met his third wife, 18-year-old Glenda Burdine, who helped spawn his pride and joy, Glenda Jean Ray, or Jessie Ray, on May 2nd, 1967. Now, this was a very busy year for him. He had just spawned his future evil accomplice, and according to him, he was becoming increasingly involved in the BDSM scene. He and his wife did act out a few of his less severe fantasies, but of course, this did nothing to satiate his deep lust for torture and murder. For that, he'd have to go looking somewhere else. A few months before his 30th birthday, David abandoned his family for an entire summer so that he could gallivant throughout Arizona and New Mexico. He hitchhiked for a while before stumbling upon an 18-year-old named Sally, who immediately became infatuated with him. Of course, the only logical decision was for them to start sleeping with each other. This man's had a whole mortgage and he's out here messing around with high schoolers. It checks out. The two continued traveling together before stopping to rest at a truck stop on Route 66. Disarmed by David's charisma and valuable mechanical knowledge, Bob, the owner of the shop, immediately offered him a job. Now, apparently, David was just the best thing since sliced bread, and soon enough, both the owner and his girlfriend were completely under his spell. According to Bob's girlfriend, Ray was very charismatic with a free-spirited personality. They'd often stay up late, smoking some banga, and just talking about life in general. Funnily enough, this man that they had grown to trust so much had, for some reason, never told them that he had a whole wife and kids, 3 kids, waiting for him at home. One morning, Bob's girlfriend went to talk to Sally, but when she got to her room, Sally and all of her things were gone. Of course, she and Bob went to David wondering where she went, but he simply smiled and suggested that she truly was a free spirit that nobody could hold down. Trusting him for his word, the couple left the situation alone. It is believed that Sally, the 18-year-old runaway, was another one of his earliest victims. Seemingly out of nowhere, David told his new friends that it was time for him to go back home. Packing his things and waving farewell, he set off on a journey back to his family. Upon obtaining his aircraft mechanic certificate in 1969, David moved his family to Tulsa, Oklahoma, after receiving an offer to teach at the Sparta School of Aeronautics. According to his coworkers, David was very quiet and generally just kept his head down. He'd simply finish his work for the day and then leave to pursue his own vices. His stepson Ron would later describe his temperament, saying, "He was a pretty mellow dad. He never raised his voice or his hand. Mom always did the discipline." But again, this was all a facade to hide his true desires. David admitted that around this time, his fantasies and urges were becoming increasingly difficult to control. There were times of peace when he'd be able to live his life without delusions, but at the drop of a dime, he'd be consumed by his lustful desires and unable to think of anything but torture and murder. It got to the point where he was no longer aroused from simple bondage, but instead now needed to think about murdering women in order to derive even the smallest amounts of sexual pleasure. 6 years after moving to Tulsa, the Ray family briefly moved to Victoria, Texas, before permanently settling in Albuquerque, New Mexico in August of 1977. With David's constant movement, the scale of his crimes is hard to pinpoint. It is believed that he had been routinely kidnapping and assaulting women during this time. However, no remains were found following a future FBI search of his known properties. Back in Albuquerque, he quickly fell back into his habits of leaving his family, oftentimes meeting sex workers to indulge in his fantasies. Glenda, like David's other wives, soon grew tired of his never-ending traveling and affairs, ultimately filing for divorce in 1991. For the next few years, he drifted and rarely visited his children that had remained in Mexico with their mother. After a short stint in the Nevada mountains as a weed farmer, David settled in Phoenix, Arizona, hoping to get a quote, normal job, and soon after began dating a woman by the name of Johnny Lee. Fortunately for David, and unfortunately for everyone around him, he was offered a position as service manager and lead mechanic at Canal Motors. With the new income, the couple soon married and began leasing multiple properties, one of which included land at Elephant Butte Reservoir at 513 Bass Road, Sierra County, New Mexico. Sierra County, or Truth and Consequences, New Mexico, was probably the best place for David to establish a secondary base. It was secluded, away from any prying eyes, and afforded easy access to the southern border, expanding his possible territory. He purchased 2 large cargo trailers and transformed them into a makeshift home. He, of course, was now making frequent visits to the property, participating in intense bondage sessions with the random sex workers. He'd later describe his meetings saying, "I'd whip them, but I'd never break the skin. Never. We had a code word we would use when it got too rough. When it got too painful for one of them, all they had to do was say the code word out loud. That code word was raspberry." While David was enjoying his new life, his now 19-year-old daughter Jessie Ray had been plotting. You see, David's side business as a drug dealer did not stop once he moved to Arizona. In fact, he'd been working closely with his daughter to find deals and customers throughout New Mexico. It was during the fall of 1985 that he cheated her out of a deal, and she simply could not let that slide. Less than a year later, in June 1986, Jessie Ray showed up at the New Mexico branch office of the FBI and filed a complaint against her father, claiming that he had been kidnapping and torturing women before trafficking them over the border. Shocked by what they were hearing, the FBI immediately launched an investigation into her claims, even interviewing David on several occasions. He at one point told them that he was dangerous, even describing the bondage fantasies that he had been having since he was 13 years old, but they just let him go. There was no physical evidence that could be found to support Jesse's claims. His proximity to Elephant Butte Lake and constant movements gave him an extremely large area to hide bodies. On September 22, 1988, David's boss at Canal Motors, Billy Ray Bowers, went missing. In the following weeks, he had started carrying a gun, telling those close to him that he was scared for his life after announcing that he wanted to sell his half of the business. Despite an extensive search and countless offers of rewards for his location, it would be over a year before his body was found, bound and shot execution style in Elephant Butte Lake. However, due to the decomposition, he was considered a John Doe for 10 years before he was ultimately identified in 1998. The close encounter between David and the FBI kind of scared him. He realized that he needed to change up his MO if he were to continue pursuing his fantasies. Thinking himself to be a sexual mad scientist, he began to design his perfect dungeon. One where he'd have the freedom to experiment on his victims using various devices of his own creation and free from any outside interference. Spending around $100,000, David purchased an additional cargo trailer and began the construction of his torture chamber, dubbing it the Toy Box. A sign reading Satan's Den greeted captives as they were led by chain and collar into a 25-foot-long trailer. Soundproof materials lined the walls, ensuring that his victims' cries for help would be heard by no one but him, something of which he happily reminded them of. Various torture devices hung from the walls, including leg spreaders, branding irons, leather belts, paddles, clamps, sandpaper, saw blades, needles, suction cups, forceps, whips, and speculum. There were metal, wooden, and plastic sex toys all throughout the trailer, and even a 15-inch motorized dildo that was attached to a giant motor that had 3 settings: buzzer, light, and probe. Ropes, pulleys, chains, and handcuffs were all over the ceiling. In one corner, there appeared to be a handmade wooden contraption that was used to forcibly flip the victims over. There was also lipstick, perfume, shampoo, and body lotions. Detailed diagrams of the human anatomy and various torture techniques were scattered throughout the trailer. There was even a weird affirmation that read, "Remember, a woman will do or say anything to get loose. They will kick, scratch, offer money, bite, yell, beg, scream, run, offer sex, threaten, lie, wait for an opportunity." Standard excuses are sob stories: menstruating, pregnant, viral diseases, sick, kids with babysitter, have to work, sick baby, sick parent, claustrophobia, missed by husband or friend, bad heart, can't miss school, don't let her get to you. If she's worth taking, she's worth keeping. She must be subjected to hypnosis before the woman is released. Never trust a chained captive. A black gynecological table attached to a custom-designed sliding system waited to embrace his captives. Once they were bound, he'd place a sensory deprivation mask over their heads before positioning a mirror above them so that they could view everything that was happening to them. Then came his now infamous 45-minute introductory tape.
"Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances. For a little while, at least, you need to get your shit together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you, and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture because this tape is being created July 23rd, 1993, as a general advisory tape for future female captives. The information I'm going to give you is based on my experience dealing with captives over a period of several years. If, at a future date, there are any major changes in our procedures, the tape will be upgraded. Now, you are obviously here against your will, totally helpless, don't know where you're at, don't know what's going to happen to you. You're very scared or very pissed off. I'm sure that you've already tried to get your wrists and ankles loose and know you can't. Now you're just waiting to see what's going to happen next. You probably think you're going to be raped, and you're fucking sure right about that. Our primary interest is what you've got between your legs.
Now, I'm not going to read the entire thing because no, but if you would like to, you can find a link to all my sources in the description below. For David, his toy box accomplished 2 goals. It gave him an easy way to indulge in his darkest desires, and it provided him with another side hustle. As mentioned before, Truth or Consequences was considered an epicenter of extreme hedonism, so to him, it only made sense for him to record the torture sessions and then sell them as snuff films on the black market. Over the next few years, he would film hundreds of pornographic videos, which is alleged to have sold internationally as well. It comes as no surprise that many future complaints would be received about snuff films showing women actually being tortured to death. Consumed by his new plan, David quit his job in Phoenix and permanently moved to New Mexico in January of 1991. He quickly made a name for himself as a quiet, knowledgeable, and dependable mechanic throughout the small town of Truth or Consequences, earning the trust of many. Over the 3 years following his move, the relationship between him and his wife continued to sour, with her ultimately filing for divorce in 1994. The breakup unfortunately allowed David to fully indulge in his sadomasochistic desires. Something that I do find crazy is the fact that he admits to seeing multiple therapists around this time, saying, "I tried to change, but it didn't do no good." Anyway, it didn't seem like some of them were too bright in the head. They didn't understand my problem, I guess you could say. "Mofo, you don't even know what's going on. What are you talking about?" Not long after settling in Truth or Consequences, David landed a job as a park ranger and mechanic at the Elephant Butte State Park. He used his position to learn as much as possible about the 40,000-acre park, hoping to avoid another slip-up like the discovery of his former boss's remains. At the same time, Jessie had completely lost faith in the legal system. Her father was seemingly untouchable, and so she decided, if I can't beat him, I might as well join him. Under the guise of caring for an ill father, Jessie made frequent visits to Truth or Consequences, where David began to teach her everything he knew about kidnapping and murdering women. After some time, they finally decided to test her capabilities, choosing to target Jessie's friend, Kelly Van Cleve. On the afternoon of July 25th, 1996, Kelly Van Cleve, along with her 4 friends, walked into the Rocks bar in Truth or Consequences. Her usual bubbly personality had been dulled after a long night of arguing with her husband, and she was hoping that the time with her friends would lift her spirits. The group ordered drinks, excluding Kelly, who was a DD, and they began to converse with each other. The doors of the bar shot open as local socialite Jessie Ray busted into the bar. Having been in the town for a few months, Kelly had become good friends with Jessie, so her presence was happily welcomed. Over the course of a few hours, the group enjoyed themselves before moving on to the Blue Water Saloon in Elephant Butte at the suggestion of Jessie. The group continued to enjoy themselves until an argument broke out amongst the friends, causing the group to disperse over the next few hours, leaving Kelly with no car and no ride home. Seeing this, Jessie is like, "Hey, I can take you home, but let's hang for a few more hours." Relieved, Kelly agrees and finally has her first beer of the night. Not even an hour later, Jessie proclaimed that she was too drunk to drive all the way back to Kelly's house, and instead, they could just go to her dad's place to sober up since it was much closer. Now, Kelly had been to the Ray family's property many times already, and she honestly felt that she could trust them, so she agreed. As the two walked out of the bar, Kelly couldn't help but feel lightheaded and mildly intoxicated, but the weird thing was, she had only had 1 drink. As she got into the passenger seat of Jessie's truck, her head started spinning and she passed out. Kelly came to as she and Jessie walked into David's home and proceeded to rest on a nearby sofa. Jessie smiled and told her to just wait a sec as she quickly walked out of the room. A feeling of uneasiness swept over her body as she contemplated the night. Had she been drugged? Ignoring her suspicions, she closed her eyes and tried to sink into the hard couch cushion. The quiet sound of footsteps grew increasingly louder until she felt the gentle yet firm pressure of a blade pressing against her throat. Without saying a word, David attached a spiked metal collar around her neck before duct taping both her mouth and eyes. Overwhelmed and confused, she passed out. David dragged Kelly's unconscious body into the dreaded toy box, bound her to a gynecological table before hooking her up to the box's pulley system. He clicked on a pre-positioned camera and then waved smelling salts under her nose. I remember being tied to a bench naked. I had my arms over my head, my knees bent, and my legs wide apart, Kelly would later testify. He then proceeded to brutally assault her with various sized wooden objects before growing tired and ending the hours-long session. Over the course of the next few days, David continued assaulting Kelly while also administering a drug mixture to her known as phenobarbital, causing a severe lapse in memory. Fortunately, Kelly does not remember much from the time she was held. On Sunday, July 27th, David Parker Ray, clad in his Green Park Ranger uniform, sat across from a confused and dazed Kelly at a local restaurant, calmly sipping on a cup of coffee. He explained that he had found her wandering around the beach incoherently and offered to drive her home. Though, even there, she was not spared a moment of peace. Upon seeing his wife, who had just been held hostage and violated for 2 days, Kelly's husband immediately launched into a rage because he, quote, figured that it was a little scam that they were pulling. David, maybe, yes. Kelly, no, not at all. This was despite her crying her heart out and trying to explain that she literally could not remember anything. Her husband still didn't believe her and proceeded to kick her off the property, and soon after filed for an annulment of their marriage. Honestly, that's just a W for Kelly. You know what's wild though, is that Kelly's quote-unquote friend, who had been there with him that night, only added to the narrative that she had gotten too drunk. Once their relationship ended, she proceeds to zoom over to this dude and get into a relationship with him. Some real snake activity if I do say so myself. For years, Kelly suffered from vivid nightmares of the night, but simply thought they were dreams despite them feeling so real. It would be another 3 years before she finally confirmed what her subconscious was trying to tell her. As David settled into his new community, he found himself becoming increasingly comfortable with the intense sex and hard drug scene that ran rampant. He'd frequently host sex parties where he'd invite the town's most prominent individuals to attend live performances of porn and sadomasochistic sessions as they sailed across a lake on his boat. His daughter, Jessie, had also been making a name for herself, becoming the go-to party person that was known to go all out in the name of a good time. During one of these outings, Jessie met 25-year-old Roy Yancey. The two quickly formed a close bond, and she eventually felt comfortable enough to introduce him to her father. As the group grew closer, the nightly bar hopping and ever-flowing stream of hard drugs became just a bit stale. So Jessie invited him to one of David's parties, where Roy later admitted that he had been tied down and assaulted with a broom handle. Even after this traumatizing experience, he had not truly been indoctrinated into the Roy cult. For that, he'd have to take a life. Marie Parker was known as a charismatic and smart woman who was extremely fun to be around. Marie, however, had an extremely difficult upbringing. Her father walked out when she was very young, leaving her with her mother, whom she claimed frequently abused her. Eventually, she ran away at the age of 14, roaming across the western US, finding a home wherever she could. At the age of 19, Marie became pregnant and soon after moved back in with her mother for help. At 21, she had her second child, but continued to work hard at her family's mailroom business to support her children. Eventually, her family's business went under, forcing her into sex work. It was during this time that Marie became a frequent sight at the Raymond's Lounge in Truth or Consequences. She was quickly introduced to the darker side of the small town, with Jessie feeding her a steady flow of drugs, pushing her deeper and deeper into the clutches of the underworld. Marie's friends would later say, "She was a really healthy person when we first met, but then she started getting into the Raymond crowd and they got her hooked on crank." As the two continued to hang out, Marie was inevitably introduced to Roy Yancey. The two fell head over heels for one another. However, Marie was growing tired of drugs and eventually decided to completely drop out of the drug scene. That, of course, meant that the coke-fueled relationship that they had built had to come to an end. After ending things with Roy, she got engaged to another man and appeared to be on the right track. That was until her fiancé found her relapsing and subsequently kicked her and her children out of his home. Rather than going back to the streets, Marie reached out to her friend, Jessie Ray, remembering that they had some land that they could spare. At the time, Jessie was planning her famous July 4th party, for which she told Marie that there would be very limited space without any partying. Heeding the warning, Marie agreed and spent the next day relaxing on the lake. On Thursday, July 3rd, Jesse's July 4th party commenced with a revolving door of friends visiting and enjoying themselves as they partied the night away. Roy, who was now married, spotted Marie and the two started chatting. Drug levels high and inhibitions low, they hooked up. Everything was going swimmingly until David Parker Ray arrived at the campsite to see the absolute carnage that the party had caused. Abandoning the calm and collected temper that he had cultivated over the years, David just started to rage at Jesse. He was heated and he demanded that they clean everything up immediately before his reputation was ruined. The group cleaned up and dispersed for the night. The next day, Marie sent several distressing voicemails to her mother saying, "I love you and I'm sorry for hurting you." On Saturday afternoon, Marie left her children with a friend and headed to the Blue Water Saloon in Elephant Butte, hoping to find more drugs. Jesse and Roy arrived not too long after and told Marie that they had a dealer ready at the Vista Memory Garden Cemetery. Upon arrival, all things appeared to be normal until Jesse suddenly pulled a gun on Marie. She threatened her, telling her not to move as she handcuffed her wrist. "Shut up or I'll kill you," Jesse screamed as she threw a bound Marie in the back seat with Roy, who continued holding her down. They drove to David's home where Roy simply watched as Jesse dragged a screaming and kicking Marie into the toy box where David sat, waiting. Marie's screams were cut short as the trailer door slammed closed. Expressionless, Roy turned around, walked into the house, sat down, and clicked on the TV. Over the next 3 days, Marie was imprisoned in the toy box with both David and Jesse ruthlessly torturing a woman who had done nothing but trust them. On July 8th, David and Jesse told Roy that they were, quote, done playing with her and it was time for her to go. He entered the toy box to see Marie gagged and bound. Pointing a gun at Roy's head, Jesse handed him a rope and said, "You know what you're going to have to do." Roy placed his knee on the chest of the woman he claimed to love and proceeded to strangle her until he no longer felt her move. David, of course, had prepared a camera to ensure that the entire thing was recorded for future distribution. They traveled with Marie's body to Monticello Canyon, where they buried her in a ravine. As David shook off his hands, he looked at Roy and threatened to kill him if he ever spoke a word of this, with Roy nodding in acknowledgement. He was now officially a part of the Ray family cult. As the last people seen with Marie, the group traveled to Galveston, Texas to hide, hoping that the heat would quickly die down. Marie was reported missing by her mother 2 days later. Multiple witnesses came forward to police, but they simply did nothing to try and find her. One of Marie's friends tried reaching out saying, "I told them where to look. I knew she was dead and that Jesse was involved." Unfortunately, only the confession of Roy Yancey many years later would confirm the fate of Marie Parker. Cindy Hindi was born on February 6, 1969 in Seattle, Washington. After years of sexual and psychological abuse from her stepfather, she finally decided to confide in her mother. As any loving mother would, she accused her of lying and kicked her 11-year-old daughter out onto the streets. Despite her small stature, she was known for being absurdly strong, which, in hindsight, may have come from her coke addiction. Over the years, she had 4 kids, all of whom she sent to live with her mother and stepfather. Yes, the same house where she was abused and kicked out of for calling out the abuse. That's where she sent her kids. Due to her addiction, Cindy frequently found herself at odds with law enforcement, once being jailed for selling coke to an undercover agent. Her streak of bad behavior came to head during the summer of 1997, after refusing to go to a court-ordered drug counseling. So instead of trying to get clean, Cindy went on the run, taking the advice of a family friend to hide in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. A year later, the Ray family found themselves back in town, believing that they were in the clear. The 3 fell back into the normal hustle and bustle, with Roy and Jesse quickly injecting themselves back into the local bar scene, where they soon met Cindy Hindi. Of course, the 3 meshed so well that Cindy began dating Roy and Jesse in a 3-way relationship. They'd frequently detail their sexual exploits to anyone that was within earshot, with one person saying, "Roy told me that Cindy liked him to handcuff her and beat her up." In early January of 1999, Jesse went to Galveston to stay with some relatives, so David invited Cindy to move in. Someone close to Cindy would later say she was infatuated with him. Suddenly she wanted to play house mom. We'd be talking and then suddenly she'd look at her watch and say, "I've gotta go. I'm gonna do David's favorite dinner tonight." Strange comments like that. Well, I was actually happy for her. Later, I realized I was being painted a real rosy picture. During her stay, David began teaching Cindy everything he could so that she could help him kidnap and torture women. She was actually pretty excited when he first showed her the toy box and couldn't wait to use it herself. "27-year-old Angelica Montano moved to Truth or Consequences in 1988. She was hoping to turn a new leaf, and this seemingly unknown town felt like the best option. On February 16, 1999, Angelica was sitting in her friend's living room when her phone started ringing. She grimaced as she heard Cindy's voice come from the phone. You see, Angelica was well acquainted with the Ray family, having been bound during one of his yacht sex parties. Too terrified to go to the police, she maintained a self-preserving relationship with them. Cindy conversed with the two until Angelica mistakenly mentioned her boyfriend's upcoming birthday. She lamented that she did not have enough money to afford a cake, to which Cindy happily offered her some spare cake mix. Angelica thanked her and agreed to meet at the TRC District Court the next day at Cindy's request. She arrived at the court the next day, waiting around an hour, and changed locations before David's truck pulled up beside her, with Cindy in the passenger seat. Cindy started to apologize profusely, saying that she had left the cake mix at her house, but if she'd like, they could all drive to go grab it. Thinking nothing of it, Angelica got into the truck. "They were so quiet, they were awfully quiet," she'd later say. Once they arrived, Cindy told Angelica to take a seat on the couch while they got the cake mix. Leaving the trailer home, David reappeared a short time later, not with the cake mix, but with a large brown box in one hand and a dagger in the other. The taste of blood filled her mouth as David punched her, and Cindy appeared holding a gun to her head. Terrified, she pleaded with him, asking for them to stop, only warranting a sharp "shut the fuck up" from Cindy. David undressed her and attached a metal collar around her neck, before handcuffing both her wrists and ankles to a bed in the living room. He started to cover her face with a leather mask, but stopped as she pleaded with him not to. With her strapped in place, David began to play the tape. As the tape came to an end, David forced her to swallow a heavily sedated orange pill, and she soon blacked out. For 2 days, Angelica was bound to the bed and forced to view her captors live their daily lives. They watched soap operas, went to work, and made dinner, quite literally acting as if she did not exist. However, it was on the second night that things escalated. David came home and calmly said that it was time she visited the toy box. With Cindy holding her at gunpoint, David bathed her and chuckled, saying, "I like my victims clean." Cindy giddily applied makeup to her face, saying she had to look her best for a video as she would be a star. In the toy box, David and Cindy subjected Angelica to many acts, employing the use of wooden sex devices up to 15 inches in length, and makeshift batteries that sent excruciatingly painful currents throughout her body, causing her to pass out. Cindy tested different levels of currents on Angelica, never allowing her a second of peace. At one point, David even used a stun gun on Angelica, with her saying, "I remember shaking, then he put something in my vagina and shocked it. It was electric. I got burns all over my legs and thighs." They subjected her to electrical torture for more than an hour before suddenly stopping. David had a soap opera that he wanted to watch, and he simply could not miss it. They took her back into the house and strapped her to a bed before David assaulted her again. She started promising him that she would never tell anyone, saying that there would be no point. He was too old and no one would believe her. Of course, she was going to tell everyone, but he didn't need to know that right now. He only smiled and told her that she'd soon be forgetting everything with his special shot. He went on telling her that he truly did like her, and if he had known how good of a person she was, he never would have taken her. 4 days after her abduction, Angelica began seeing a more compassionate side of David. He gave her some clothes and a cup of coffee, and then allowed her to call a friend to arrange a pickup. She held her breath as David walked over to her and hugged her, saying, "Don't worry, nothing's going to happen to you." She'd later admit that she believes the only reason that she was freed was because she acted as friendly as possible, saying, "It's a good thing I did play head games with him and get him to be on my side. If I would have fought them and started being a bitch, I think I would have died." Officer Gary Labo was driving along I-25 when he saw Angelica on the side of the road attempting to flag down a car. Pulling over, she began pleading with him, saying that she needed to get away as fast as possible. She settled into the front seat and let out an exasperated sigh before asking Officer Leyba for a smoke. She took a soft toke of the bud and turned to look at him. "If I told you something, you're not going to believe me." As she explained her time at the Ray property, Officer Leyba sat there in shock. He immediately suggested that she file a police report. However, Angelica forcefully declined. You see, she had unfortunately confused David's park ranger uniform with that of a police officer, thus believing that the police were actually in on it. It was at this point that Leyba started to doubt her story, saying, "If I felt as though she was 100% legitimate, I would have taken her to the police right then." The aftermath for Angelica proved to be just as horrific. Following her escape from David and eventual arrival back at home, she immediately told her father, who proclaimed that they were going to travel back to Truth or Consequences to kill both David and Cindy. Unfortunately, just 4 days after her escape, her father was murdered in a completely unrelated deal. She later said, "Me and my father were going to kill them. Then my father died. So then I said, you know what, I'm just going to leave it up to God." On March 13th, 1999, Cindy popped up unannounced at neighbor Jean Brana's home. Cindy, who was already a few drinks deep, bragged about how amazing her new life was, especially after meeting David. This time, rather than the usual dive into their sexploits, she started admitting everything that David had done, including the murder of his former boss, Billy Ray Bowers. Cindy said she knew about 6 or 7 women that were in the lake. This was only while they were together. Jean would later explain. According to Hendy, Ray mainly preyed on prostitutes, drug addicts, and down and outs, whom no one would miss. Many of his victims were girls he'd snatched from across the Mexican border and then brought back to Bass Road to be tortured and murdered. To dispose of the remains, Cindy explained that he would slice open the bodies and fill them with stones before throwing them in the lake. This is how he was able to get away with so many murders for so long. She even went as far as saying that there were, quote, hundreds of them. Jean's stomach had dropped. She had no clue if Cindy was just crossfaded or if she had truly gone insane. It definitely didn't help that Cindy literally said that she could not wait to suffocate the next girl and experience the ultimate rush of murder. Despite being, quote, shocked and stunned by what they were hearing, they simply chopped it up to her being too drunk and high out of her mind. Unfortunately, David and Cindy had every intention of following through, going on the prowl just 8 days later for what, unbeknownst to them, would be their final victim. On the afternoon of March 19th, 1999, 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil was making her way down the street when she noticed an acquaintance flagging her down. As she walked over, he motioned toward a motorhome and indicated that a man was looking for her services. She needed money and figured that she could spare 30 seconds, so she agreed. She walked into the trailer to see an older, tan, very wrinkly man. They introduced themselves, discussed pricing, and continued the casual conversation as David started the RV. However, as the car started moving, something in the air shifted. David pulled out a silver police badge and told her that she was under arrest for solicitation. Then Cindy just casually appeared from out of the bathroom holding a pair of handcuffs. But Cynthia was like, y'all got the wrong one, and immediately started fighting back. She started pulling my hair and kicking me until they finally got me handcuffed and shackled, she would later testify. David actually had to pull the truck over and help Cindy because of how hard this woman fought. The entire drive, Cindy sat next to Cynthia holding a knife and taking back bottles of wine. They eventually stopped at a gas station where they forced her to strip naked before placing a black mask over her head. Cynthia stated that the drive was incredibly long with a few stops in between. In the end, she had traveled more than 150 miles away from where she was originally picked up. Upon arriving at the Ray household, Cynthia was led into a bedroom with whips and a variety of different medical devices. Cynthia stated that Cindy put a metal collar with a padlock and chain around her neck before briefly leaving her there, dazed and confused. Over the course of 3 nights and 2 days, Cynthia was subjected to a variety of unthinkable tortures. She was assaulted using various sized sex objects as well as being shocked by generators. She was suspended from chains and beaten with a cat o' nine tails, and shocked with a stun gun that was placed between her thighs as weights pulled on her chest. At one point, David poured gravy on Cynthia before bringing his dog in and allowing it to assault her. She stated that when they weren't actively assaulting her, they'd chain her to a nearby bed in the living room and just casually watch soap operas all day while she sat there. Throughout the entire ordeal, David took numerous photos of her and at some points even showed her photos of the other women that he had abducted. On March 22nd, Cynthia woke up to David wearing his Green Park Ranger outfit, getting ready for work. As he walked out the door, he chuckled and said he had a special surprise for her and that she was soon going to experience his toy box. She was slightly familiar with his toy box, having heard of it from his and Cindy's passing conversations, but she, of course, had no clue what they were preparing her for. Thinking that she was too weak to try anything, David removed the chains from her legs and arms, but left the one around her neck in place. As Cindy kissed David goodbye and walked into the living room, she absent-mindedly dropped the shackle keys on a table close to Cynthia. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She carefully stretched out her leg and pulled the table just close enough for her to grab the keys. She quickly unlocked the padlock holding her to the wall and shuffled over to the phone, dialing 911.
911? What is your emergency?
Pain shot through Cynthia's head as a lamp shattered against her skull. "You're not going anywhere!" Cindy Indy screamed. Searching for a weapon, Cynthia picked up a nearby ice pick and began stabbing Cindy in the head. "I took off out the front door and ran," she'd later say. On the other end of the line, the operator was only able to hear what sounded like a scuffle before the call was disconnected. She issued a follow-up call, but when it was picked up, an annoyed and clearly out of breath woman answered. She told the operator that the call was a mistake and that everything was okay before hanging up. Still, the operator felt something was off and requested a welfare check just to be safe. Sierra County deputies David Elston and Lucas Alvarez were close by and responded to the call. As they drove down the road, they spotted a woman on the side, desperately trying to get their attention. They pulled over, and the woman started telling them how she had just seen a naked and bleeding woman running down the street with a chain around her neck. At that moment, their radios went off. "I'm calling for a young lady that just ran into my house. She says she's been raped. She's got a chain on her. Send someone right away. This lady is naked. She says they've been holding her for 3 days. With a new sense of urgency, the two jumped in their car and sped away. Deputies Elston and Alvarez arrived at the property of Donald Breach, who explained how this random lady barged into their home, screaming, "Please help me, don't let them get me." Hearing the police sirens, Cynthia busted out of the home, now wearing a pink robe, screaming, "I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive!" Deputy Alvarez described the moment he saw her, saying she was terrified. She was naked and just covered with blood, with this collar and chain around her neck. There was splattered blood on her face and her teeth. Alvarez agreed to take her to the hospital, while Elston investigated the call from Bass Road. The property was straight out of a nightmare. Piles of garbage, rundown sheds, and abandoned trailers littered the yard. As Deputy Elston took his first steps into the hell house, he was greeted by an oversized dildo casually placed on the counter. He looked around and noticed a blood-stained mattress sitting next to a bloody ice pick and what remained of a shattered lamp. Elston quickly noped out the house and called in for backup. Park Ranger Byron Wilson overheard the commotion regarding the naked woman and recognized the address as one of his employees, David Parker Ray. On his way to the lot, he casually waved at a familiar-looking cream-colored RV, but at the same time, could not fully recognize the occupants. However, when he arrived at the house and confirmed that it was indeed David's home, he realized that the RV he passed was David and he was more than likely trying to escape. Wilson, along with the rest of the present police, raced after the two, desperate to catch them before they got away. He eventually caught up with them, pulled them over, and demanded that they step out of the car. As David stepped out of the RV, he apparently shouted, "This isn't necessary," before being placed in handcuffs. Cindy, however, had a huge gash above her left ear, was bleeding profusely, so she was taken to a hospital, while David was taken to the Richard R. Cooper Boat Training Center because it was closer and apparently had better resources than the local police departments. Arriving at the Ray property, Sheriff Terry Byers immediately reached out to the New Mexico State Police, saying, "Once we looked at the house, we determined that it was just a little bit out of our league." Criminal investigator Wesley LaQuesta arrived at the hospital requesting that no one speaks to either Cindy or David, saying that Cynthia was 100% the only one that should be speaking on what had transpired. The entire time Cynthia was there, she kept repeating to herself, "I'm safe here," over and over again. She was covered from head to toe in cuts, bruises, burns, and puncture wounds. Hospital staff used bolt cutters to remove the collar, after which she chucked it across the room, which, understandable. After taking a shower and settling in, Cynthia detailed the horrific 3 days of hell that she had experienced while being held captive by David and Cindy. Now, as mentioned, Cindy Hindi had been injured, so the police took her to the closest hospital, which just so happened to be the exact same one that Cynthia was being held at. While they were escorting her through the halls, she actually walked past Cynthia, who started freaking out, saying, "That's her! Don't let her in! She's here for me!" Annoyed, Cindy pointed at her and said, "That girl should be checked because that bitch is on heroin." When interrogated, both Cindy and David denied everything, stating that they were simply helping Cynthia kick a drug addiction. However, when police searched their property, they found around 401 items that did not belong to David or Cindy. They also found journals where David recorded most, if not all, of his crimes. In them, he listed the number of times he assaulted his victims, their heights, weights, and ages, but unfortunately left no hints as to where they were buried. Of course, the discovery of the toy box was something in of itself, and the New Mexico branch of the FBI was immediately called in. On the morning of March 24th, David Parker Ray and Cindy Hindi were arraigned at the Sierra County Magistrate Court. The two were escorted separately into the court by armed police, who protected them from the line of reporters and outraged people. Ray was charged with kidnapping, multiple counts of criminal sexual penetration, assault with intent to commit a violent felony, and 2 charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and criminal sexual penetration. Hindi was charged with kidnapping, accessory to the crime of criminal sexual penetration, assault with intent to commit a violent felony, criminal sexual penetration, and conspiracy to kidnap. They each now face up to 93 years behind bars and $85,000 in fines. Judge Thomas Petsack set bail for both defendants at $1 million. Though, as the bail was set, Cindy, who had been on David's side completely, did a whole 180. She immediately called her lawyer and went to work confessing all of her crimes. According to her, she 100% knew that David was a dangerous guy, and he trusted her enough to actually tell her about most or all of his crimes. She started with the murder of the unidentified schoolmate, detailing how much he, quote, loved it and became aroused from the abuse he inflicted. Still, she chose to stay with him because honestly, she was messed up too and was like, low-key same. Birds of a feather, I guess. She continued on, stating that he particularly liked to go after sex workers because he considered them to blame for, quote, putting themselves in a position of danger, and believed that their disappearance would go unnoticed by law enforcement. According to Cindy, David loved to target women he was physically attracted to, which, fun fact, his type was very much not Cindy. I low-key find this funny because she did all this for this man and he didn't even really like her like that. That's just chef's kiss, I love it. She also confirmed the thought that David had victims everywhere, with her saying that anywhere he had traveled or stayed, he ended up kidnapping and torturing women. This is more than likely why little evidence of his murders can be found. Either he fed them to the farm animals he owned at various points, or simply disposed of their remains throughout the US. Cindy explained that he admitted to killing a minimum of 30 people, with around 18 of them happening in Sierra County. She went on to say that after moving in, she had helped him abduct several women from surrounding towns. She said that they let a few go, but most all of them were murdered. She knew of at least 14 girls and women that he murdered in the 8 months they were together. With these statements, investigators continued studying the tapes, hoping that they'd be able to identify some of the women in the videos. Fortunately, in one of the videos, a tattoo was identified, which eventually led them to contacting Kelly Von Cleve, who, at this time, really had no clue that she was involved with any of this. Like, they literally called her in and had her watch videos of herself being tortured on camera, and she barely remembered any of it. Like, that's wild. Now, during Cindy's confessions, it came out that Roy Yancey was also involved in the crimes. So they track him down and tell him what they know, and he immediately folds. He stated that he was not involved in all the murders, but admitted to the murder of Marie Parker. He agreed to take them to the burial site, but when they got there, they found nothing. Of course, everyone was confused, except for Roy, who stated that he quite honestly believed that David just came back and moved the body. He suggested that David would go to insane lengths to ensure that no evidence could ever be found, which makes sense. As investigations proceeded and Roy was taken to jail, he one day received an anonymous letter that only read, "Rats die in jail." Although it couldn't be proven, prosecutors were sure that David sent the note. Suddenly, Roy said he couldn't testify and instead pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The only witness that they had now was Cindy, but this didn't last too long either. In November of 1999, the DA received word from Cindy that she was taking back everything that she said. Now apparently, when David found out she was working with the feds, he started smuggling love letters to her, whispering sweet nothings, and she soon filed a motion to take it all back. So, she was sentenced to 36 years in prison for Cynthia and Angelica's abductions. David's defense team tried to argue that all of the women in the videos consented and that he was simply helping them kick a drug addiction. Some of the jurors actually believed this, and the judge was forced to call a mistrial. In 2001, Cynthia Vigil testified against David in her own trial and made sure to let the jury know that she was 100% an unwilling participant. As the trial came to an end and the jury were getting up to deliberate, David's lawyer jumped up and stated that he wanted to do a plea deal. Now, Jesse Ray, who had been apprehended not long after Cindy's confessions, was now preparing to stand trial for helping him out. It was upon learning this that David agreed to a guilty plea on all remaining charges if Jesse was released with time served. The court agreed, and he was sentenced to 224 years in prison. Glinda Jean Ray pleaded guilty to no contest to kidnapping charges in 2001 and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, plus 5 years of probation. In May of 2002, David contacted authorities saying that he was willing to confess, truly confess, to everything. However, right before the meeting was held, this asshole died from a heart attack, just 8 months after he had been convicted. After serving 18 of her 36-year prison sentence, Cindy Hindi was released from prison on July 15th, 2019, where she immediately moved to Hamilton, Montana. Of course, all her neighbors protested this decision, but there's only so much you can do. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find much about Jesse, so I mean, just watch out, because you don't just do all of that and then suddenly like, oh, I'm a perfect citizen. No, that's not how it works. I'm sorry. Especially after getting only 2.5 years in prison. Like, Jesus Christ, yet there are people still in prison for literally like an eighth of weed. For many of the agents that were assigned to the case, the images and tapes that they consumed will forever be ingrained in their memories. Unfortunately, one agent by the name of Patricia E. Russ had reached her breaking point. After spending 4 days meticulously recording every item in the trailer, she submitted her final report to her superior before sadly ending her time on the earth. To this day, investigators are still working to identify many of the victims, with one source saying, as long as we're getting those leads and as long as the exposure in the press keeps generating interest in the case, we're going to keep investigating this. As with all of my sources, links to the evidence collected by investigators can be found in my description. Honestly, please just take a look, as you never know. You might be the missing link needed to identify another victim. Alrighty y'all, that is it for this case. As always, thank you guys so much for the support, and I can't wait for you to see some of the upcoming content I have in store, which will not always be as dark, so stick around. In the meantime, if you'd like to see some more videos like this,